My name is Donovan Thorne. I am 52 years old, and 6 weeks ago, my world shifted when my estranged Uncle Cornelius passed away, leaving me $10 million in his will. I sat in that sterile lawyer's office in downtown Portland, the inheritance papers trembling in my hands. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and shock. But even as the reality of those numbers sank in, one decision crystallized in my mind like ice forming on winter glass. Not a single soul in my family would ever know. You see, in my family, love has always been measured in dollar signs and favors owed. Money isn't a tool, it's a weapon, wielded by whoever needs something and aimed at whoever might provide it. And I was about to discover just how deep that ugliness ran, how little I truly meant to the people who shared my blood. Here's the part you won't believe. Before I ever deposited a single cent of that fortune, before I even left that lawyer's mahogany-paneled office, I decided to test them all. I would tell my children Cassandra, my ambitious daughter, and Tobias, my struggling son, that I was broke, desperate, unable to make rent. I'd ask them for help, just a small amount compared to what I'd given them over the years. I wanted to see who would step forward when they thought I had nothing left to offer. The answer would shatter everything I thought I knew about family. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. That first night after signing those inheritance documents, I didn't go home to my modest apartment in Southeast Portland. Instead, I drove to Mount Tabor and sat on a bench overlooking the city lights, the manila envelope beside me like a ticking bomb. $10 million. Uncle Cornelius, the black sheep who'd made his fortune in tech startups, the man my father had always called too clever for his own good, had chosen me. Not my siblings, not their children. Me. For 30 years, I'd been the family's safety net. When Cassandra needed money for her MBA at Stanford, I'd liquidated my retirement account. When Tobias's restaurant venture collapsed, leaving him drowning in debt, I'd taken out a second mortgage on my house. When my sister Delphine's husband abandoned her with 3 kids, I'd sent monthly checks until she got back on her feet. But when my own world had crumbled 5 years ago, when my wife Irene died of cancer and the medical bills nearly bankrupted me, where had they been? Cassandra was between opportunities, despite her 6-figure consulting salary. Tobias was figuring things out in his art studio, somehow always short on money despite the trust fund I'd helped establish. Even Delphine, whom I'd supported for 2 years, suddenly discovered urgent home repairs that ate up her budget. I'd learned then that in my family, generosity flowed in only one direction, toward them. Now, with Uncle Cornelius's fortune burning a hole in my conscience, I had the power to finally see their true faces. Growing up as the middle child in the Thorne family meant learning early that attention was earned, not given. My older sister Delphine had inherited our mother's sharp tongue and social ambitions, while my younger brother Sterling possessed our father's natural charm and business instincts. I was the steady one, the reliable one, the son who never caused drama or demanded the spotlight. Our parents, Helena and Bradford Thorne, ran a successful accounting firm in Northwest Portland. They taught us that family meant obligation, that love was demonstrated through sacrifice, and that asking for help was a sign of weakness. Thorns take care of their own, my father would say, usually while writing another check to bail Sterling out of his latest financial disaster. I married Irene when I was 28, and for 22 years, she was my anchor in the storm of family dysfunction. She worked as a librarian at Portland State University, and together we built a quiet life filled with small joys. Weekend hikes in the Columbia River Gorge, used bookstores, and dinner parties with friends who chose us for who we were, not what we could provide. Irene was the one who first pointed out the pattern. You know they only call when they need something, she'd said gently one evening after Sterling had hung up, having secured yet another loan from us. I'd defended them then, insisting that family was complicated, that love wasn't always convenient. But she was right. When we couldn't conceive children of our own, not one of them offered emotional support, only Delphine's passive suggestion that we keep trying as if infertility was a matter of insufficient effort. When we finally adopted Cassandra and Tobias, siblings aged 8 and 6 from a troubled home, my family's reaction was telling. "Are you sure you want that responsibility?" Sterling had asked, earning him a month of silence from Irene. The children became my redemption project. Cassandra, brilliant but guarded, channeled her early trauma into academic achievement. Tobias, sensitive and creative, found solace in art and cooking. I poured everything into giving them the stability they'd never known, the unconditional love I'd rarely received myself. When Irene got sick, the medical bills mounted like an avalanche. Experimental treatments, specialists, hope purchased in $100,000 increments. I mortgaged everything, liquidated everything, called everyone, and learned, in the cruelest way possible, that the love I'd invested in my family had earned me exactly nothing in return. Now, staring at Uncle Cornelius's legacy, I wondered if Irene had been wrong about one thing. Maybe love couldn't be unconditional after all. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and old coffee. Miranda Foxworth, Uncle Cornelius's estate attorney, had called me 3 days after the funeral with cryptic words. "There are some matters we need to discuss regarding your uncle's estate." I'd barely known Cornelius. He was my father's younger brother, the one who'd disappeared to Silicon Valley in the early '80s and emerged decades later with a fortune built on software patents and strategic investments. He'd attended family gatherings like a ghost present but detached, watching our dysfunction with amused interest. "Your uncle was quite specific in his instructions," Miranda said, sliding the documents across her polished desk. "The bulk of his estate goes to you, Mr. Thorne. $10 million, after taxes and fees." The number hung in the air like smoke. I stared at the papers, my name printed in official fonts beside astronomical figures. "Why me?" Miranda smiled thinly. "He left a letter." She produced a cream envelope with my name written in Cornelius's spidery handwriting. "Donovan," the letter began. "You're probably wondering why I chose you. The answer is simple. You're the only one in this family who never asked me for anything. Not once in 30 years did you call requesting an investment, a loan, or a favor. That absence of expectation told me everything I needed to know about your character. I've watched this family bleed you dry for decades. I've seen you sacrifice your security, your dreams, even your wife's final months of comfort, to prop up people who wouldn't cross the street to help you. Now you have the power to discover who they really are. Use it wisely. Uncle Cornelius." I folded the letter, my hands surprisingly steady. Outside the window, Portland stretched gray and drizzly. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that everything in mine had just changed. But as I walked back to my 15-year-old Honda Civic, Uncle Cornelius's words echoed. "Now you have the power to discover who they really are." A plan began forming, cold and methodical. I wouldn't tell anyone about the inheritance. Instead, I'd create a test. A simple, devastating test that would strip away every excuse, every pleasant lie, every comfortable rationalization my family had built around their selfishness. I would ask my children, the ones I'd sacrificed everything for, to help me when I needed them most. And then I'd see exactly what 24 years of love and sacrifice had been worth. That evening, I sat in my cramped studio apartment, the place I'd moved to after selling the family home to pay Irene's medical bills, and opened my laptop. The inheritance documents lay beside me like a roadmap to a country I'd never imagined visiting. First, I needed to secure the money without leaving traces. I researched private banking, trust structures, and financial privacy laws. Uncle Cornelius had been thorough. The inheritance came with detailed recommendations for discretion, including contacts for attorneys who specialized in keeping fortunes hidden. I called Maxwell Sterling, no relation to my brother, thankfully a trust attorney whose name Uncle Cornelius had included in his files. Within a week, the $10 million was secured in accounts that existed only as numbers on password-protected screens. To the world, including my family, I remained Donovan Thorne, widower, retired middle school teacher, struggling to make ends meet on a meager pension. The test required careful choreography. I needed a scenario that would feel genuine, desperate enough to warrant asking for help but not so catastrophic that it would trigger suspicion. I settled on a rent crisis, my landlord demanding back rent, threatening eviction, a sum that any loving child should be able to manage. The amount needed to feel significant enough to matter, but reasonable enough that refusal would be inexcusable. I decided on $3,000, enough to cover rent and utilities, small enough that both Cassandra, with her consulting salary, and Tobias, despite his artistic struggles, he could find a way to help if they truly wanted to. I purchased a small digital recorder, the kind private investigators use. If this experiment was going to shatter my illusions, I wanted evidence, not for legal purposes, but for my own sanity. My family had always been masters of rewriting history, of transforming their cruelty into kindness through selective memory and emotional manipulation. To make the scenario believable, I staged my apartment. I spread fake shut-off notices across my kitchen table, crafted a convincing eviction letter using templates I found online, and practiced my story until desperation felt real in my voice. I also needed an anchor, someone who could keep me grounded when doubt crept in. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had become a friend during the dark months after Irene's death. She was 78, sharp as broken glass, and had no tolerance for family drama. "You're playing with fire," she warned when I outlined my plan over tea in her cluttered apartment. "What if they surprise you?" "Then I'll be happily wrong," I replied. But we both knew better. Mrs. Chen had watched Cassandra and Tobias visit exactly 3 times in the 2 years I'd lived there, all when they needed something signature on forms, access to old family photos, my input on decisions that affected them financially. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it and see who my children really were when the masks came off. I called Cassandra first, on a Tuesday morning when I knew she'd be between client meetings at her consulting firm in Seattle. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Dad, this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" I let my voice waver slightly, injecting just enough desperation to sound convincing. "Cassandra, I need help. I'm in real trouble." Her tone shifted immediately, not to concern, but to caution. I could almost hear her mental shields going up. "What kind of trouble?" "I'm behind on rent. 3 months behind. My landlord filed for eviction yesterday. I need $3,000, or I'll be on the street by Friday." The silence stretched across the phone line like a chasm. I could almost hear the calculations running through her head, weighing the cost against her convenience, measuring my crisis against her comfort. "Dad, that's a lot of money. How did this happen? I thought your pension covered basic expenses. Medical bills from your mother's treatment are still trickling in. The insurance company is fighting everything retroactively. I've been robbing Peter to pay Paul, and now Peter's out of money too." "Okay, but 3,000? Her voice carried that familiar tone I remembered from her teenage years, the one that suggested my problems were somehow evidence of my failures. "Can't you negotiate with your landlord? Work out a payment plan?" "I tried, sweetheart. He's done waiting. Cassandra, I've never asked you for anything I couldn't eventually pay back. But right now I'm desperate. If I lose this apartment, I don't know where I'll go." "Dad, I just signed a lease on a new downtown condo. The down payment and moving costs wiped out my liquid savings. Maybe in a few months, after my next bonus. But right now is really terrible timing." Terrible timing. Her father potentially becoming homeless was terrible timing. "I see. I understand you have your own responsibilities. Maybe ask Tobias. He's always been more flexible with money than I am. And he's local. It would be easier for him to help." The irony was staggering. Tobias, whose restaurant failures I'd financed twice, was more flexible with money than Cassandra, whose MBA I'd paid for by emptying my retirement account. After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone. I'd expected deflection, but the casual dismissal still stung like a physical blow. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Cassandra, immediate deflection, blamed timing and liquidity, suggested asking Tobias instead. No offer of alternative help." That afternoon, I called Tobias. He was in his art studio in Northeast Portland, probably working on another sculpture that would never sell but made him feel authentically artistic. His voice was warm, distracted. "Hey, Pops, what's going on? You sound stressed." I repeated my story, word for word, letting more desperation creep into my voice this time. The eviction notice, the 3 months of back rent, the Friday deadline. Tobias listened without interrupting, then sighed heavily. "Oh man, that's really rough. I wish I could help, but I'm completely tapped out. The studio rent alone is killing me, and I just had to replace my kiln after that electrical fire. Tobias, it's $3,000. Without it, I lose my home." I know. It totally sucks, and I feel awful about it. But I literally don't have access to that kind of cash right now. Have you tried calling Aunt Delphine?" She's got that big house in Lake Oswego now, so she must be doing pretty well. Another deflection. Another suggestion to make me someone else's problem. What about a smaller amount? Maybe we could work out something gradual. 500 now, more later. Dad, you know I'm terrible with regular payments. Remember that student loan situation? I kept missing months and screwing up my credit. His voice brightened as if he'd just solved a puzzle. Hey, maybe you should look into senior housing options. Some of those places are actually pretty nice, and they have sliding scale payments based on income. Senior housing. My 30-year-old son was suggesting I abandon my independence rather than inconvenience himself with helping me. Right. Senior housing, I'll look into that. Great, and Dad, don't stress too much about this. Things have a way of working out, you know? After hanging up, I added to my notebook. Tobias, sympathetic tone but immediate deflection, suggested senior housing as solution. No concrete offer of help despite years of my financial support. 2 calls, 2 rejections, 2 confirmations of what I'd suspected but desperately hoped wasn't true. My children, the ones I'd raised from traumatized 8 and 6-year-olds into educated adults. The ones I'd sacrificed everything to support couldn't be bothered to help their father avoid homelessness. The test was working exactly as I'd feared it would. Over the next week, I expanded the experiment beyond my immediate children. If Cassandra and Tobias had failed so completely, what about the extended family I'd supported for decades? I called my sister Delphine first, now living comfortably in Lake Oswego thanks partly to the monthly checks I'd sent during her messy divorce 8 years ago. Her voice was bright, cheerful, completely unprepared for my desperation. Donovan, how wonderful to hear from you. I was just thinking we should have lunch soon. It's been ages. I delivered my rehearsed crisis, letting genuine emotion creep into my voice as I described the eviction notice, the mounting bills, my fear of ending up on the street. Her response was swift and brutal in its casual cruelty. Oh my goodness, that's just terrible. But Donovan, you know Roger and I are completely stretched thin with Sophia's wedding coming up. $28,000 for the venue alone. Can you believe these prices? Maybe you should consider downsizing. That apartment always seemed too expensive for your teacher's pension anyway. Downsize. From a studio apartment. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so heartless. Delphine, I helped you for 2 years when Marcus left you with 3 kids and no income. $24,000 in total support. That was different, Donovan. I had children to think about, and you offered to help. No one forced you to send those checks. Her voice hardened slightly. Besides, that was years ago. People's circumstances change. You offered to help. My generosity reframed as voluntary foolishness. My sacrifice dismissed as ancient history. Next, I tried my brother Sterling, the golden boy who'd borrowed more money from me than anyone else. Over the years, $42,000 for failed business ventures, gambling debts, and what he called temporary cash flow issues that somehow never resolved themselves. Donnie, his voice boomed with false enthusiasm. Been too long, brother. How's retirement treating you? I explained my situation with growing desperation, each word feeling more real as I spoke it. The eviction, the homelessness, the complete absence of options. Sterling's laughter was like breaking glass. $3,000 for rent? Jesus, Donovan, what kind of palace are you living in? Maybe it's time to face reality about your lifestyle expectations. My lifestyle expectations? Sterling, I live in a 400-square-foot studio with a Murphy bed. Look, I'd love to help, but Valencia and I just closed on that vacation place in Bend. Mountain property has brutal mortgage payments, property taxes, maintenance, plus, you know how it is in my business. If I start lending money to family, everyone will expect handouts. Everyone will expect handouts. The man who'd never repaid a cent was worried about setting precedents. What about something smaller? Even $500 would help with groceries while I figure this out. Can't do it, brother. Cash is too tight right now. But hey, have you looked into those senior living communities? Lots of amenities, built-in social networks. Might be perfect timing for a fresh start. I documented each conversation meticulously, my notebook filling with evidence of their systematic indifference. But the pattern was clear. Every person who'd taken my money over the years had suddenly discovered principles about financial boundaries the moment I needed help. The most painful test came when I called Mrs. Patterson. Irene's closest friend from the university. She'd been practically family attending our anniversary parties, sending birthday cards, crying with me at Irene's funeral. "Oh, Donovan," she said after I'd explained my crisis. "That's just awful. But you know, Harold and I are on fixed incomes too since retirement. Everything's gotten so expensive." Even she deflected, suggesting I contact social services, apply for emergency housing assistance, look into programs for seniors in crisis. Everyone had solutions that didn't involve them actually helping. By the end of the week, I'd made 8 calls, 8 rejections, 8 variations of the same message. Your emergency is your problem to solve. That Friday evening, I sat in Mrs. Chen's apartment, showing her my notebook of documented responses. "I'm sorry, Donovan," she said simply, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. "But are you really surprised?" No, I wasn't surprised. But surprise and heartbreak aren't the same thing. The following week, I decided to escalate the test. If they could ignore my housing crisis, what would it take to penetrate their indifference? I called each of them again, this time with updates that painted an even grimmer picture. The eviction went through, I told Cassandra, letting my voice crack with exhaustion. "I'm living in my car right now, parking behind the Safeway during the day, trying to find safe spots at night. I haven't showered in 3 days." Her response was clinical, detached, as if she were discussing a case study rather than her father's crisis. "Dad, that's not sustainable. There are resources, shelters, social services, senior programs. You don't have to live in your car." "I'm not ready for a shelter, Cassandra. Those places, the things I've heard." I let my voice trail off, hoping she'd offer what any loving daughter would. Her spare room, her couch, some temporary sanctuary. Instead, "Dad, you're being too proud. This situation requires professional intervention, not family band-aids. Maybe it's time to seriously consider assisted living. Some facilities have emergency placement programs." Assisted living. She wanted to warehouse me in an institution rather than let me sleep on her expensive furniture. With Tobias, I painted an even darker picture. "Son, I haven't eaten a real meal in 4 days. I'm too ashamed to go to food banks, but I'm running out of options. Yesterday, I found myself staring at expired yogurt in a dumpster." His response was somehow worse than Cassandra's clinical dismissal. It was pity without action, emotion without commitment. "Oh God, Pops, that just breaks my heart. But you've got to swallow your pride and use the resources that exist for people in your situation. There are food banks, soup kitchens, programs specifically designed for homeless seniors. People in your situation." I'd become a demographic, a social problem, not his father who'd raised him from a traumatized child into a functioning adult. I was hoping I could stay on your couch for a few nights, just until I figure out next steps. "Dad, my studio is tiny, and I've got this big installation piece taking up most of the space. Plus, my girlfriend's been staying over most nights. It would be super awkward and cramped for everyone." When I called Sterling with news of my homelessness, his response revealed the depth of his selfishness. "Donovan, maybe this is the wake-up call you needed. You've always been too proud to access appropriate help. There are government programs, charity organizations, social workers trained for exactly this situation. You don't have to make your crisis into everyone else's emergency. Make your crisis into everyone else's emergency." The man who'd borrowed $42,000 was lecturing me about burdening others, but it was Delphine who delivered the cruelest blow. When I told her I was sleeping in my car, her voice turned sharp with accusation. "Donovan, this feels like emotional manipulation. You're trying to make us feel guilty for having reasonable financial boundaries. It's not healthy behavior. And frankly, it's beneath the dignity you usually show." Emotional manipulation. My desperation was psychological warfare. My homelessness was a character defect designed to make them uncomfortable. Each conversation felt like surgery without anesthesia, cutting away illusions I'd clung to for decades. The fake eviction notices on my table seemed increasingly real. The staged crisis had become a psychological reality. I was homeless, not physically, but emotionally and spiritually. My family had abandoned me so completely that the performance had merged with reality. Mrs. Chen found me crying in the hallway outside my apartment one evening, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their indifference. This was supposed to prove they loved me, I whispered. Instead, it's proving they never did. She helped me inside, made tea with hands that trembled slightly with age and suppressed anger. The test is working perfectly, she said quietly. It's just not giving you the answer you wanted. That night, I stared at my notebook, pages filled with evidence of their systematic cruelty. Tomorrow, I would begin preparing for the final confrontation. It was time to see if money could resurrect love that had never truly existed. The plan for the final confrontation required surgical precision. I couldn't simply reveal the inheritance and expect them to understand the magnitude of their failure. I needed to create a moment so clear, so undeniably documented, that they couldn't rewrite the narrative later through selective memory or emotional manipulation. I contacted Miranda Foxworth and arranged for complete documentation, not just bank statements, but legal papers proving the inheritance's legitimacy, trust documents showing the money's security, and a preliminary will that I'd have her prepare one that would demonstrate exactly how their choices had consequences. Next, I rented a conference room at the downtown Marriott, something formal enough to convey the gravity of what was coming. The sterile environment would prevent them from using emotional manipulation or familiar surroundings to derail the conversation. I sent each family member a carefully worded text. Family meeting this Sunday, 3 p.m., Marriott Conference Room B. Important estate matter regarding Uncle Cornelius. Attendance mandatory. Affects everyone. The vague reference to Uncle Cornelius's estate would ensure they showed up. They had no idea they were walking into their own judgment. I spent hours with Mrs. Chen, rehearsing not just what I would say, but how I would maintain emotional control when they inevitably tried to justify their cruelty or shift blame back onto me. They'll make excuses, she warned, her sharp eyes reflecting decades of observing human nature. They'll claim they were protecting you from dependency, or that you never really communicated the severity of your situation clearly enough. Don't let them gaslight you. I also prepared comprehensive recordings. This final conversation would be preserved in its entirety, not just for my own sanity, but as insurance against their future attempts to rewrite history. The hardest preparation was emotional. Despite weeks of documenting their failures, I still carried a thread of irrational hope that when confronted with their cruelty, they might show genuine remorse, might demonstrate some capacity for growth or change. Mrs. Chen saw me wavering Saturday evening and gripped my hand with surprising strength. Donovan, you've spent 24 years giving them chances to love you unconditionally. This isn't about punishment, it's about accepting reality. They are exactly who they've shown themselves to be. The inheritance just gave you permission to see it clearly. Saturday night, sleep eluded me completely. I kept replaying memories that now felt different in light of their recent failures. Cassandra's college graduation, where she'd thanked everyone in her speech except the man who'd paid for it all. Tobias's art show opening, where he'd talked about overcoming childhood trauma but never mentioned the father who'd provided the stability that made healing possible. Family dinners where my contributions were assumed but never acknowledged. The signs had always been there. I'd simply chosen blindness over heartbreak. Sunday morning, I dressed carefully, not in my usual casual clothes, but in the charcoal suit I'd worn to Irene's funeral. It seemed appropriate. Today, I would bury the last of my illusions about what family meant. I arrived at the conference room an hour early, arranging chairs in a circle, placing my notebook and documentation at the head of the table. The inheritance papers sat in a manila folder, waiting for their moment of revelation. At 2:45, I activated the recording device and sat quietly, centering myself for what was to come. By 3 p.m., they would all be here, expecting some routine estate discussion about Uncle Cornelius's modest leftover affairs. Instead, they would face a mirror reflecting their own cruelty with perfect, undeniable clarity. They arrived within minutes of each other, as if they'd coordinated their timing, which, knowing my family's tendency toward conspiracy, they probably had. Cassandra entered first, her professional demeanor intact, checking her phone with practiced efficiency. Tobias followed, looking confused and slightly annoyed at being summoned on a Sunday. Sterling and Delphine came together, whispering between themselves about what this mysterious meeting might involve. They took their seats around the conference table, glancing at the formal setting with growing puzzlement. The sterile hotel conference room felt appropriate, neutral territory where emotional manipulation would be harder to deploy. "Dad," Cassandra said, her voice carrying that familiar note of impatience. "Your text was pretty cryptic. What's this about?" Some of us had to rearrange weekend plans. I looked at each of them in turn: my children, my siblings, the people I'd loved most fiercely and served most faithfully for decades. In moments, they would learn exactly what this meeting was about. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. "I know this seems unusual, but there are some things we need to discuss about Uncle Cornelius's estate, and more importantly, about this family." Sterling leaned forward eagerly, dollar signs practically visible in his eyes. Did he leave something significant to the family? I always suspected the old man had more tucked away than he let on. "In a way, yes," I said, opening my notebook to the first page of documented conversations. "But first, I want to talk about the past month. You see, I've been conducting an experiment." Tobias frowned, his artistic sensibilities apparently detecting something ominous in my tone. "What kind of experiment, Pops?" I looked directly at Cassandra, my voice remaining calm and factual. 4 weeks ago, I called you. I told you I was facing eviction, that I needed $3,000 to avoid becoming homeless. Do you remember what you told me?" Her face flushed slightly, discomfort replacing her professional composure. "Dad, what does this have to do with Uncle Cornelius's? You said the timing was bad because you'd just bought a new condo. You suggested I ask your brother instead, making my crisis into his problem rather than offering any concrete help yourself. I turned to Tobias before he could speak, and you told me you were completely tapped out, that I should consider senior housing rather than expect family assistance. You suggested I essentially give up my independence because helping me would be inconvenient. Dad, where is this going?" Tobias's voice carried defensive undertones. "Sterling," I continued, consulting my meticulous notes, "you actually laughed when I explained my situation. You said I was living beyond my means in a studio apartment and worried that helping me might create precedents with other family members." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Donovan, I don't appreciate this public interrogation. If you needed money, you should have been more direct about—" "More direct?" I let the word hang in the air like smoke. "I told you I was sleeping in my car. I told you I hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. How much more direct could I have been?" Delphine crossed her arms defensively. "This is ridiculous, Donovan. You're trying to make us feel guilty for having reasonable financial boundaries. We all have our own responsibilities and limitations." "Boundaries," I repeated softly, tasting the irony. "That's an interesting word for it." I opened my notebook wider and began reading from my careful documentation. "Let me share some numbers with you that might provide context for these boundaries." I looked at Cassandra first. "Over the years, I've given you approximately $89,000. MBA tuition at Stanford, graduate school living expenses, security deposits for 3 different apartments, car payments, emergency medical bills, and what you called career transition support during job changes." Cassandra's face went pale. "You never said those were loans that needed to be repaid." "You're absolutely right. They were gifts from a father who wanted to see his daughter succeed and build a stable life." I turned to Tobias. "$67,000 for you over the years. 2 restaurant startup investments that failed. Art supplies and studio rent for nearly 2 years. Your share of therapy costs after we adopted you. Emergency car repairs, medical bills, and general living support during your finding myself periods." "Dad, I never demanded any of that," Tobias protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, you didn't demand it. You mentioned your struggles, and I offered help because I believe that's what families do for each other." I looked at Sterling, my brother who'd perfected the art of borrowing without repaying, $42,000 over the years. Business loans that were never repaid, gambling debt bailouts, that time you needed money to avoid foreclosure on your house, numerous smaller emergency requests. Sterling's face had turned red, but he remained silent. "And Delphine," I continued, "$24,000 during your divorce, plus countless smaller amounts for the children's school expenses, medical bills, and Christmas gifts you couldn't afford to buy yourself." Delphine stood up abruptly. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this accounting session. What's your point, Donovan? I closed the notebook and looked directly at each of them. My point is that over the years, I've given this family over $222,000. Money I earned through 35 years of teaching. Money I scraped together by living modestly, saving carefully, and often going without things I wanted so I could help when you needed it. I paused, letting the weight of that number settle in the room. And when I needed $3,000 to avoid sleeping in my car, not one of you could find a way to help. Not one of you even offered a smaller amount, or a place to stay, or any concrete assistance whatsoever. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Portland traffic. Now, I said, reaching for the manila folder, let me tell you about Uncle Cornelius's estate and what it revealed about all of us. I opened the manila folder with deliberate care and withdrew the inheritance documents, spreading them across the conference table like evidence in a trial. The official letterhead from Miranda Foxworth's law firm was clearly visible, along with state seals and signatures that proclaimed the document's unquestionable legitimacy. 6 weeks ago, I began, watching their eyes focus hungrily on the papers. I received a call from Uncle Cornelius's estate attorney. It seems our eccentric uncle, the family member most of you rarely bothered to acknowledge, left his entire fortune to someone in this family. Sterling couldn't contain himself, leaning forward to scan the visible numbers. How much are we talking about here, Donovan? $10 million, I said quietly, letting the number settle like a stone dropped into still water. The silence was immediate and absolute. Cassandra's phone actually slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. Tobias's mouth opened without sound. Even Delphine, usually so composed, stared in undisguised shock. 10 million, Cassandra whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. Uncle Cornelius was worth $10 million? I nodded slowly. Software patents from the early days of Silicon Valley, strategic investments in tech companies, real estate holdings across 3 states. He was very successful and extremely private about his wealth. Sterling was already calculating, his entrepreneurial mind racing ahead. So how does the distribution work? Does it get divided among surviving family members? Are there specific bequests for— No, I interrupted firmly. It doesn't get divided. Uncle Cornelius left his entire fortune to one person. The room erupted in questions. Who? Why? When would the distribution happen? How had this decision been made? I held up my hand for silence, then picked up Uncle Cornelius's letter. Uncle Cornelius spent decades observing this family. He watched how we treat each other, how we handle money, how we define love and loyalty, and he left very specific instructions about his decision. I read aloud from the letter. You're the only one in this family who never asked me for anything. Not once in 30 years did you call requesting an investment, a loan, or a favor. That absence of expectation told me everything I needed to know about your character. The realization hit Delphine first. He left it all to you, she said, her voice flat with shock. He did, I confirmed. Sterling shot to his feet, beginning to pace the small conference room. This is insane. One person inheriting everything? What about family equity? What about the rest of us? Uncle Cornelius thought about that very carefully, I said, pulling out another document. He actually considered distributing portions to each family member, but then he included a fascinating provision, a test, if you will, to see what kind of people his potential heirs really were. Cassandra grabbed for the document, scanning it rapidly. What kind of test? He wanted to see what would happen if the primary beneficiary, me, faced a financial crisis, whether this family would rally to help someone who had helped them, or whether your true nature would be revealed when helping required sacrifice rather than just receiving benefits. The room went deadly quiet as understanding began to dawn. Tobias was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. The phone calls, the eviction notice, you needing money for rent, all part of Uncle Cornelius's test, I confirmed. I've had access to this inheritance for weeks. I could have paid rent for the next 100 years without worrying about money, but Uncle Cornelius was curious about something. And frankly, so was I. Sterling spun around, his face flushed with anger and realization. So this was all a setup? Some kind of sick psychological experiment? Not an experiment, I corrected firmly. A test of character. And you all failed it completely. I opened my notebook and began reading their responses verbatim. Their excuses, their deflections, their casual suggestions that I solve my problems through social services rather than inconvenience them with my crisis. While I was supposedly sleeping in my car, hungry and desperate, not one of you offered genuine help. Instead, you offered advice about programs for people in my situation, suggestions to downsize from my studio apartment, lectures about financial responsibility and emotional manipulation. Delphine tried to interrupt. We didn't know about the inheritance. You didn't know I was your brother. You didn't know I was Cassandra and Tobias's father. You didn't know I'd given everything I had to support this family for decades. My voice remained steady, but the words carried the weight of accumulated disappointment. You knew exactly who I was, and you chose your comfort over my survival. Every single one of you. Cassandra was crying now, but I recognized these as tears of loss, not grief for my pain, but panic about the inheritance slipping away from her. So what happens now? Sterling asked, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a second set of documents, these bearing yesterday's date. Now you learn about the consequences of the choices you made. The second set of documents I placed on the table represented hours of careful thought and legal consultation. My last will and testament, updated to reflect everything I'd learned from Uncle Cornelius's test, lay before them like a mirror reflecting their true characters. Uncle Cornelius anticipated this moment perfectly. I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. He knew that once the inheritance became known, there would be attempts at reconciliation, promises of change, claims that circumstances rather than choice had prevented help. I opened the new will to the relevant pages. He was absolutely right. In the 10 minutes since I revealed the inheritance, I've seen more concern for my well-being than I witnessed during my entire month of supposed homelessness. Suddenly, everyone is worried about family relationships and wants to ensure I understand that you would have helped if only. Cassandra leaned forward desperately. Dad, if we had known about the money, if you had known about the money, what would have changed? I interrupted. You would have treated me differently because I could provide something for you? That's exactly the problem, Cassandra. Your love has always been conditional on what I could give. I turned to the will's distribution page. This document represents my response to Uncle Cornelius's test and the lessons you taught me about family loyalty. Sterling moved closer, trying to read over my shoulder. But I continued speaking. Cassandra Thorne Morrison receives $15,000 from the inheritance. This represents approximately 17 cents for every dollar I gave her over the years, with interest calculated based on her complete inability to offer even token assistance during my crisis. Cassandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad, please, we can fix this. Tobias Thorne receives $12,000, I continued. A similar ratio based on his suggestion that I abandon my independence and enter senior housing rather than burden him with helping me maintain my dignity. Tobias looked physically ill. Pops, I didn't understand how serious. Sterling Thorne receives $8,000, I said, ignoring their protests. This accounts for his $42,000 in unpaid loans, plus interest on his statement that helping family members sets dangerous precedents. Sterling's face had turned purple. You can't be serious about this, Donovan. Delphine Morrison receives $5,000, I finished. Exactly what she claimed she couldn't spare when her brother faced homelessness, with a bonus for calling my desperation emotional manipulation. Delphine was shaking now, her composure finally cracking. This is cruel, Donovan. We're still family. Are we? I asked quietly. Because when I needed family most, you were all nowhere to be found. I turned to the final page of the will. The remaining $9,950,000 will be distributed among various charitable organizations, with the largest portion establishing the Irene Thorne Foundation for families facing medical bankruptcies. The room erupted in shouting, threats, and accusations. But I wasn't finished. There is one exception, I said, my voice cutting through their protests. One person who passed Uncle Cornelius's test with flying colors. They fell silent, hope flickering in their eyes. Mrs. Chen, my 78-year-old neighbor who lives on Social Security, receives $500,000. When she learned about my supposed crisis, she immediately offered what little savings she had and invited me to move in with her rent-free rather than see me sleep in my car. She's not even family, Sterling roared, his control completely gone. No, I agreed. But she acted like family when none of you would. She demonstrated what love looks like when it's not based on transaction or expectation. Cassandra was sobbing openly now, but her tears felt performative, calculated. Dad, we can be better. We can change. Please give us another chance. Another chance? I stood up slowly, gathering my documents. I gave you chances for 24 years with Cassandra and Tobias, and decades with Sterling and Delphine. I gave you money, time, love, support, and sacrifice. And when I needed the tiniest fraction of that love returned, you all discovered principles about financial boundaries. I looked at my children, the two people I'd loved most desperately after Irene. You want to know the cruelest irony? If either of you had offered genuine help, even if you couldn't manage the full amount, if you'd shown any real concern for my welfare, I would have stopped the test immediately and told you the truth. All I needed was evidence that you cared about me as a person, not just as a provider. But we do care. Tobias protested, his voice breaking. No, I said with infinite sadness. You care now that you know about the inheritance. That's not love, that's investment strategy. I walked toward the conference room door, then paused for one final truth. The will has already been filed with the court. The charitable distributions have already been arranged. The inheritance is no longer mine to change, even if I wanted to. Sterling made one desperate attempt. We can contest this. No court will uphold. Contest away, I said calmly. But remember, I have recordings of every conversation we had during my supposed crisis. Your own words will be played back, documenting your systematic abandonment of a desperate family member. I'd be curious to hear you explain that to a judge. I opened the door and stood in the threshold, looking back at them one final time. Uncle Cornelius taught me the difference between love and transaction. For decades, you've all been treating me like a bank rather than a family member. And banks don't receive love, they provide services in exchange for benefits. Goodbye. Please don't contact me again. 6 months later, I sit in my new home, a comfortable craftsman bungalow in southeast Portland with a garden that Irene would have adored. The inheritance has provided security, but more importantly, it's given me something I never expected: clarity about what family actually means and the courage to build it on my own terms. The first weeks after the conference room revelation were brutal. Voicemails I didn't return, emails I deleted unread, even attempts at ambush visits to my old apartment before they learned I'd moved. Each contact followed the same pattern: anger, bargaining, promises of change that felt hollow after decades of contrary evidence. Sterling hired an attorney to contest the will, exactly as he'd threatened. The case was dismissed within a month once my lawyer played the recorded conversations in court. Hearing their own voices dismissing my desperate pleas for help made their abandonment legally undeniable. The judge actually commented that she'd rarely seen such clear documentation of family members systematically failing someone in crisis. Mrs. Chen used her portion of the inheritance to establish the community garden she'd dreamed about for years, a space where neighbors could grow vegetables and build connections that didn't depend on financial transactions. Money is only valuable if it grows something beautiful, she told me, her ancient hands deep in rich soil. We tend that garden together most mornings now. Two people who've learned that family is something you choose and cultivate rather than something you're born into. She's become the family I never had, someone whose love exists without conditions, whose care doesn't require payment or performance. I've started volunteering at the Adult Literacy Center where Irene once worked. Teaching people to read reminds me daily that growth is possible at any age, that it's never too late to learn new ways of being in the world. My students don't know about the inheritance, they know me simply as Mr. Thorne, the patient teacher who brings extra supplies and genuine encouragement to every session. The Irene Thorne Foundation has already helped 43 families avoid bankruptcy due to medical crises, the kind of devastating situation that destroyed our savings and revealed my family's true nature. Each thank you letter reminds me that love multiplies when you give it freely, something Irene understood instinctively and tried to teach me through her example. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh in my judgment, if there might have been gentler ways to handle the revelation. But then I remember Cassandra's immediate deflection when I called for help, Tobias's casual suggestion that I enter senior housing, Sterling's laughter at my desperation. I remember the cold efficiency with which they all solved my crisis by making it someone else's responsibility. The inheritance didn't change who I was, it revealed who I'd always been underneath their expectations. Just as the test revealed who they truly were when love required sacrifice rather than just offering benefits. Last month, I received a handwritten letter from Cassandra. She's in therapy, she wrote, working to understand why she failed so completely when I needed basic human compassion. She didn't ask for money or reconciliation, just acknowledgement that she's trying to become someone capable of loving without calculating cost. I haven't responded yet, and I may never respond. The beauty of my new life is that I have the luxury of choice, finally freed from the obligation to maintain relationships that existed primarily to drain me. 3 weeks ago, I met someone at the literacy center, Elena, a retired nurse whose husband died 2 years ago, who volunteers there because she believes in the dignity of learning. We've had coffee twice, and she's never asked about my financial situation or what I might provide for her. She seems interested in who I am rather than what I have, a novelty that still surprises me. My name is Donovan Thorne. I inherited $10 million and discovered it was worth far less than I'd imagined because it couldn't purchase a single moment of genuine love from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But it did buy me something infinitely more valuable: the truth about what family means and the courage to build one based on choice rather than obligation. Uncle Cornelius was right about everything. The money revealed character, theirs and mine. And sometimes, the most expensive lesson is learning when to walk away from people who see you as a resource rather than a human being. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the wisdom to recognize your own worth.